Today we're starting on David Hume, the Scottish empiricist, and certainly the greatest of the empiricists, one of the greatest philosophers of modern philosophy. And he completes our set of British empiricists. We had the English John Locke, the Irish George Berkeley, and now we have the Scottish David Hume. And you could make the argument that Edinburgh, Scotland, in the 18th century was one of the intellectual centers of Europe, with the great philosopher and economist Adam Smith holding a chair of philosophy or moral philosophy, as it was just then called, at Edinburgh. David Hume, who resided there, and then another great modern philosopher who we don't read, Thomas Reid, was also present at Edinburgh. So Hume was born in 1711 and dies in 1776, a good date to remember since it's the date of American independence. He was educated in law, and in a very young age, you can see at just 22 or so, he begins work on his treatise of human nature. And before that, he had suffered from a bout, it says hypochondria here, but it was really a bout of depression that came from his philosophical inquiries. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. But the treatise was published when he was very young, and was an ambitious work that covered all of human nature, covered not only a science of the mind and how human psychology worked, but also questions of morality as well, and human action. It was said in his biography that the treatise on human nature was stillborn from the presses, and was not successful at all. And it's only later that he'll publish the work that we're reading called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. He would also publish a second inquiry concerning the principles of morals, which was another condensation of the treatise on human nature. It became a popular thing in modern philosophy to publish the condensed, popularized version, just as Berkeley had published the dialogues as a condensation and a popular version of a treatise concerning the principles of morals. And we'll see Kant doing the same thing as well. Hume had attempted to get the chair at moral philosophy in Edinburgh, but that chair went to Adam Smith instead, and he never holds a consistent academic position. He spent most of his life connected to various different noble families and holding various different small official posts. He became most famous, not from his philosophy, but from his history of England, which is still read and published. And the volumes of that work sold so well that he became rich from the proceeds of his publications. One of the first philosophers who actually made a living on the basis of his publications. Throughout the latter part of his life, he became well known, and as you can see, gathered a community of people around him who he helped critically and financially, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the famous French writer, with whom he also engaged in a famous controversy or disagreement during the latter part of his life. He was one of the most famous atheists of the time, in fact, the only avowed atheist that we're reading in the class. And it's not until after he dies that he publishes his famous dialogues concerning natural religion. Natural religion was the name given to a rational study of religious topics based upon natural reason alone. And it was there that he gave his famous account of his criticism of the argument from design and his account of the problem of evil. Let's talk about just two of the famous features or events in Hume's life. The first is called Hume's crisis, which, as you can see from this article in the Atlantic magazine, is still a topic of interest. As you heard, he thought that an interest in abstract philosophy and profound research, as he said, will severely punish you by pensive melancholy. So it was thought that his studies of philosophy undermined his religious beliefs and threw him into a crisis of depression. And it was only the writing of the treatise that allowed him to pull himself out of that. And his solution to this crisis was to apply himself to practical matters and to not allow his philosophical investigations to intrude upon the practical running of his life. So his very famous statement was, "Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man." And we'll see how, in some way, that's a motto for all of Hume's philosophy, which is going to be reducing the status that abstract reasoning has, the type of reasoning that people like Descartes and Plato had thought was the essence of the human soul, and instead say that most of what makes us human is carried out by psychological forces within the mind of association and custom and habit. So it's David Hume was the first modern critic of that modern idea that there was some part of human rationality that was completely objective and rational and separate from material life. And instead is going to try to show how the studies of the empiricists and getting clear about what the real meaning of an idea was will show that almost all of what we call human reason is in fact tied into our practical lives and is associated with psychological laws of custom and habit rather than objective and detached reasoning. The other famous event in Hume's life is his death. As one of the most famous atheists of the time, people had often said that there are no atheists on the deathbed, and there were common stories of deathbed conversions. So people had an intense interest when Hume took to his deathbed from a bout of abdominal cancer. Reporters such as James Boswell visited him on his deathbed, and there was intense interest as to whether Hume would recant his atheism and come to believe in God or an afterlife at the time of his death. And it was reported by Boswell that he thought that it was a most unreasonable fancy that a human being would believe that they would continue to exist forever. So he remained true to his atheism till the very end. So the Enquiry and the Treatise are an attempt, in some ways just like John Locke's essay was, to construct a science of the mind. In fact, we'll see him producing three great laws of human psychology, just as Newton had produced three great laws of motion. So he says astronomers had long contented themselves with proving from the phenomena the true motions of order and magnitude of heavenly bodies, until Newton at last came up with the correct laws. There's no reason, he says, to despair of equal success in our inquiries concerning mental powers, if we prosecute them with equal capacity and caution. It's probable that one operation and principle of mind depends upon another, which again may be resolved into more general and universal laws. So Hume's treatise attempts to understand human nature scientifically, and some people think this is the first real psychological work that attempts to come up with psychological laws that govern the human mind in the same way that Locke had. And just as Berkeley tried to clarify and get more consistent about what an idea was by getting rid of the idea of abstract ideas. Hume is going to try to simplify and clarify even more what exactly we mean by ideas. He's going to take as his starting point Berkeley's view that ideas are concrete and specific images or pictures, that they are not abstract, general, naked and precise appearances, as Locke had thought. And he's going to agree with the empiricist principle that nothing in the mind that wasn't first in the senses. Whereas Berkeley and Locke are both going to take memories as stored impressions that are capable of being produced indifferently on the basis of language. Hume is going to think that ideas are merely paler copies of impressions, that they differ only in the force and vivacity of the experience. You can think of a vivid experience that you have as you're actually having it. You can't not have the experiences that you're having now. You can't see the world, can't stop seeing the world in front of you. If you feel pain, it impresses itself upon your mind powerfully. If you remember pain, or if you remember this experience, they fade away and they have less force and vivacity. This idea he took from Thomas Hobbes, the earlier English empiricist philosopher, and it mimics the idea of momentum or force or energy in physical things. Later, Freud will use the same idea to talk about sort of the hydraulic force of various different drives being repressed and being redirected in some ways. But for Hume, the idea is that there's something like a kinetic energy to certain ideas. The very vivid ones that come directly from our senses he calls impressions. And then ideas are merely paler copies of those impressions that differ from them only in their force and vivacity. They're faded versions of those impressions. So not only is there nothing in the mind that wasn't first in the senses, for Hume, our ideas are merely faded versions of those impressions. None of this changing of our simple ideas of sense that Locke talked about by abstracting and creating complex ideas. Instead, Hume is going to say that all of our thoughts and ideas are merely faded versions of impressions. And whenever we try to use language, the meaning of that language must always be traced back to the original sense impression or feeling. And like Locke, he'll distinguish between external sense impressions and internal sense impressions. But all of our mind is composed of these impressions, of feelings of our internal state like love and desire, or impressions of our external state like color and perception of objects and force, and sound and taste and textures. So Locke thinks that all of our ideas have to be feeble copies of our impressions, or more lively ones, and that there can be no ideas that aren't, in fact, copies of some impression that we have. So he uses the same types of arguments that Locke and Berkeley had, repeating Locke's claim that if someone is missing a sense impression, or if someone is blind or hasn't had a certain type of experience, they can have no idea, no matter how language may describe it to them. They can form no idea of that object, because an idea is just a faded impression, and if they have no impression of that thing, it's impossible for them to construct it. One of the strange things about this passage in the Inquiry, and it also occurs in the more original treatise, is that Locke considers a counterexample to his own claim, and admits that there's a strange case in which we can be said to have an idea for which we have no corresponding impression. His example is called the missing shade of blue. He says if we imagine, as in this image here, a series of blue, imagine that they're paint chips or something, and in the middle of them we see a gap in which the progression towards darker blue is interrupted. He thinks that we'd have to admit that we could come up with an idea of the missing shade of blue. But he thinks that this is not a counterexample that requires you to change the general principle, that every idea is just a faded copy of some impression. The idea here is that the mind is capable of taking an impression it already has and another impression it already has, and then altering those impressions, making them more or less of some feature of the impression. And our imagination might be able to alter the impressions that it has in some way. But that still would be the case that even this missing shade of blue would have its origin in some impressions, either this one or this one, that already existed in the mind. So the missing shade of blue admits that our imagination has the ability of extending our impressions, but all of the ideas that we have still have to come from some impression. And this leads to his general empiricism, which he's going to use to reform philosophy, just as Locke wanted to argue for toleration by showing that oftentimes the religious ideas that we disagree so strenuously on really arise from terms or ideas which have no meaning or to which we can ascertain no truths. Hume is going to go even further and say that any language or talk that doesn't connect itself with some actual impression is actually meaningless. So he's going to say we have to inquire whenever we have a suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning. We have to inquire from what impression is that supposed idea derived. And if it be impossible to assign any, this will serve to confirm our suspicion that it's meaningless. So just as Locke saw himself not as creating giant systems, but as freeing human beings from their confusion, so Hume thinks that this clarified and simplified empiricism of tracing every piece of language back to the sense impression from which it arises will allow us to see when our language is meaningless and the types of dangers and nonsense and evil that arises from people's use of language when there really is no real meaning to that language, when it is merely empty verbiage because there is no impression to which it can be traced. So it turns out then that whereas Locke had his many, many folders that had abstract ideas that served as indexes, already we saw that much of the knowledge came from the principles of organization and the folders that were not actually ideas. In Berkeley, our general language comes from our ability to allow a single idea or a single word to indifferently represent many different particular concrete images, since there are no abstract ideas for Berkeley. And we saw that meant that the work of the mind no longer rested in a mind's eye or a light of nature which saw clearly and distinctly some innate ideas, some rational ideas from a perfectly objective and rational detached standpoint. Instead, the whole work of mind is going to be done by customs and habits, movements of the mind that occur beneath the surface that we don't know the source of, and that follow certain psychological laws, not laws of reason like the laws of logic, but psychological laws that were not necessarily connected with the truth of those ideas. Our human minds, Hume is going to think, are guided by psychological and sometimes irrational laws, and not by perfectly reasonable laws that come from our supernatural ability to grasp the forms of things. And as I said, he's going to come up with three basic psychological laws that are the source of all of our thinking. and they'll form the basis of our ability to come to beliefs and to understand things. So all of our thought is going to be constructed out of the psychological laws of resemblance, contiguity, a word which just means nearness or closeness in space or time, and cause and effect. So resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect are the three great laws of association that move our mind. So instead of our minds being moved by the light of nature, or a light of reason, which sees things clearly and distinctly, and then is moved by God or by remembrance of some intuitive grasp of the nature or forms of things in another world. Instead, our thinking is guided by psychological laws of association, and they need not be derived from the truth. Hume has very little idea where these laws come from. They're like the black boxes we talked about in Locke for functionalism. Just like Hume, he's going to pose no hypothesis about what's going on inside the mind to cause these laws, just as Newton posed no hypotheses about what causes the three laws of nature. Instead, he's just going to observe these laws and say that there's some physical cause of our thought rather than a supernatural cause. So resemblance means that whenever you see one thing, it'll make you think of things that are similar to it. And if you look at this quote from the abstract of the treatise, where he summarizes them, these laws are so important that the very last lines of the abstract to the treatise describe the three laws. Resemblance is when a picture naturally makes us think of the man it was drawn for, or one dog makes us think of another dog that's similar to it. There's contiguity, which is closeness in space and time. St. Denis is a great cathedral or basilica in Paris, so when you see St. Denis, your mind will naturally think of Paris. When you see the desk of the person next to you, when you see that desk, it'll lead you to think of the person who usually sits in it, who's next to it in space or time. And the last law, a very important one, is cause and effect. When we see an effect, we'll be led to think of the cause, and vice versa. When we see lightning, we'll be led to think of the thunder that will follow. So all of the workings of the human mind are going to be determined by these three psychological laws. And next time we'll talk about what belief is and how that affects our knowledge of causation.